Well, hello, welcome to Night and Tales, where history is another tale to be told. Today's tale is about Limoges, a town which rose up in defiance against the English. But what will their response be? Let's find out.
The smoke hung thick in the air, a suffocating shroud that seemed to choke the very life from the once bustling streets of Limoges. I clutched my sword tightly, the cold steel a stark contrast to the burning fury in my heart. My name is Thomas, a soldier in the service of Edward the Black Prince, and I stand on the precipice of a nightmare forged in fire and blood. It was only a few weeks ago that we received the news Limoges had betrayed us. The town, under English control, had surrendered to the French and opened its gates to the Duke of Berry. The Black Prince was livid, his eyes burning with a cold, calculating rage. We marched with a singular purpose, to reclaim what was ours and punish those who dared defy us. The journey to Limoges was arduous, the days blending into a haze of relentless marching and grim determination. As we approached the town in the second week of September, the sight of the imposing walls of Limoges filled us with a sense of foreboding. We set up camp, the tension palpable as we prepared for the siege. The Black Prince's orders were clear: there would be no mercy. The siege began in earnest. We bombarded the walls with a relentless barrage of trebuchet stones and flaming arrows. The sound of our assault was a deafening cacophony, a symphony of destruction that echoed through the valley. The defenders fought valiantly, but it was only a matter of time before their resolve would break. I stood on the front lines, watching the stone missiles arc through the sky before crashing into the walls with thunderous force. The ground shook with each impact, and the walls began to crumble bit by bit. The defenders atop the walls, silhouetted against the sky, scrambled to repair the breaches, but our barrage was relentless. As the days passed, the mood in the camp grew darker. The Black Prince, his expression a mask of cold fury, inspected the lines daily. His presence was a stark reminder of our purpose. Conversations were hushed, the men wary of incurring his wrath. The air was thick with tension, the knowledge that the final assault was imminent weighing heavily on us all. One evening, as I sat by the campfire sharpening my blade, a fellow soldier, William, approached. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow. "Thomas," he said quietly, "do you ever wonder about the people in there? The civilians, I mean, not just the soldiers." I looked up, surprised by the question. It was rare for us to speak of the townsfolk. They were the enemy, after all. But I couldn't deny the unease that gnawed at me. I try not to think about it, I admitted. It makes what we have to do harder. William nodded, his gaze distant. "I heard the Black Prince is planning something big. Tomorrow, maybe. The final push." I tightened my grip on the whetstone, the reality of what lay ahead sinking in. Then we must be ready. The following morning, the order came. The Black Prince had decided it was time to breach the walls and take the town by force. We gathered at dawn, the air crisp and cold. The tension was palpable as we assembled, our armour clinking softly in the stillness. The assault began with a renewed barrage of stones and fire. The walls, already weakened, groaned under the onslaught. I watched as a massive trebuchet stone smashed into a section of the wall, sending a plume of dust and debris into the air. Shouts echoed from within the town as the defenders scrambled to hold their positions. Then came the signal. A horn blast, deep and resonant, cutting through the chaos. We surged forward, a wave of steel and fury, crashing against the crumbling defences. I found myself at the front, my heart pounding in my chest as we charged. The breach was narrow, a jagged opening in the wall barely wide enough for a single man to pass through. I squeezed through, my sword at the ready. On the other side, the defenders were waiting. French soldiers, their faces grim, stood shoulder to shoulder, their weapons raised. The clash was brutal. I swung my sword, the blade connecting with a sickening thud against the defender's shield. The force of the impact reverberated up my arm, but I pressed on, pushing deeper into the fray. All around me, the sounds of battle filled the air, the clash of steel, the grunts of exertion, the cries of the wounded. Time seemed to slow as I fought, each moment stretching into eternity. I could feel the weight of my armour, the sweat trickling down my back, the sting of smoke in my eyes. The faces of my comrades, twisted in determination and fear, flashed before me. We were a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. But the defenders were tenacious. They fought with a desperation born of knowing they had nowhere to retreat. I saw one of my comrades fall, a spear piercing his side. I felt a surge of rage, my vision narrowing as I cut down the attacker. The streets of Limoges were a chaotic maze, the narrow alleys and winding roads amplifying the confusion. We pushed forward, street by street, house by house. The resistance was fierce, but we were inexorable. The civilians, caught in the crossfire, screamed and fled. Some tried to hide, but there was no escape. The Black Prince's orders were clear: no mercy. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the smouldering ruins, the resistance finally crumbled. The town was ours. The defenders lay dead or dying, the civilians huddled in fear. The once proud city of Limoges was reduced to a smouldering ruin, its streets slick with blood. The enamel workshops, once the pride of the town, were now nothing but ashes and rubble. In the aftermath, as I stood amidst the wreckage, a strange numbness settled over me. The horrors I had witnessed, the lives I had taken, they weighed heavily on my soul. The town of Limoges lay in ruins, its people shattered, its spirit broken. The sack of Limoges would be remembered for its brutality, a dark chapter in the annals of the 100 Years' War. For me, it was a haunting reminder of the price of loyalty and the terrible cost of war. As the smoke slowly cleared, I knew that the memories of this day would haunt me for the rest of my life. The day after the town fell, I awoke to a grim silence. The fires had mostly burned out, leaving behind a smouldering wasteland. The stench of smoke and death hung in the air, a miasma that clung to everything and everyone. The euphoria of battle had faded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive sorrow. The price of our victory was etched into the ruins around me. As I walked through the devastated streets, I saw the full extent of the destruction. Buildings reduced to rubble, charred remnants of homes, and the bodies of the dead lying where they had fallen. It was a scene of utter desolation, the aftermath of a storm of steel and fire. I stumbled upon a group of my fellow soldiers, gathered around the entrance to one of the larger buildings, the town hall, now little more than a shell. Inside, the Black Prince himself was addressing a few of his commanders. His presence was as imposing as ever, his dark armour and stern visage a stark contrast to the ruin around him. "The town has paid for its betrayal," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "But we must ensure this lesson is not forgotten. Search the town, bring any surviving leaders to me." His words were met with grim nods. I watched as the commanders dispersed, their faces hard with determination. The Black Prince turned and caught sight of me, his piercing gaze seeming to look right through me. "Thomas," he called, beckoning me over. I approached, my heart pounding. "I have a task for you. Find any remaining leaders or influential figures in this town. We must show them the price of defiance." I nodded, the weight of his command settling on my shoulders. "Yes, my lord." I spent the next few hours combing through the ruins with a group of soldiers. We found a handful of townsfolk hiding in basements and cellars, their faces gaunt with fear and despair. Among them was the town's mayor, a portly man with a trembling chin, and a few members of the town council. We rounded them up and brought them to the town square, where the Black Prince awaited. The square was a scene of stark contrast, the imposing figure of the Black Prince standing amidst the rubble, surrounded by his armoured knights, facing the ragged, terrified townsfolk. The mayor was forced to his knees, his eyes wide with terror. "You have betrayed us," the Black Prince said, his voice carrying across the square. "You have brought this upon yourselves." The mayor sobbed, pleading for mercy. "We had no choice, my lord. The French forces were overwhelming. We did what we thought was best for our people." The Black Prince's eyes narrowed. "And this is the result. Let this be a lesson to any who would think to betray us. No mercy for traitors." With a swift motion, he drew his sword and, in one fluid movement, beheaded the mayor. The body crumpled to the ground, blood pooling in the dirt. The remaining townsfolk cried out in horror, but there was no escape. One by one, they were executed, their deaths serving as a grim warning to any who might think to defy the English crown. The executions over, the Black Prince turned to us. "We leave at dawn. Ensure the men are ready." As the crowd dispersed, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. I turned to see William, his face pale and drawn. "How many more, Thomas?" he asked, his voice a mere whisper. "How many more towns will we destroy? How many more people will we kill?" I had no answer for him. The weight of our actions pressed down on me, a crushing burden that threatened to overwhelm. The town of Limoges lay in ruins, a testament to the brutality of war and the unforgiving nature of our quest for vengeance. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the images from my mind, the faces of the townsfolk, the sound of the Black Prince's sword as it struck, the look of terror in the mayor's eyes. Sleep eluded me, my thoughts a tangled web of guilt and sorrow. At dawn, we marched out of Limoges, leaving the smouldering ruins behind. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the scars of this siege would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the cost of war and the dark path we had chosen. The 100 Years' War raged on, and with each step, I wondered how many more towns would suffer the same fate as Limoges. As we left Limoges behind, the road ahead was a grim reminder of the devastation we had wrought. The countryside was eerily silent, the once vibrant villages now deserted, their inhabitants having fled or been killed in the wake of our campaign. The sky was a dull grey, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. It felt as though the very heavens mourned the bloodshed we had caused. Marching alongside my comrades, I couldn't help but notice the change in our ranks. The men, once boisterous and eager for battle, now walked with heads bowed, their faces etched with weariness and remorse. The weight of what we had done in Limoges hung over us, all like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the cost of our victory. William walked beside me, his usual jovial demeanour replaced by a sombre silence. We hadn't spoken much since the executions in the town square, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The camaraderie that had once bound us together seemed strained, frayed by the horrors we had witnessed. As we made camp that evening, I found myself drawn to the outskirts, seeking solace in the solitude. I sat by a small stream, the gentle babble of the water a stark contrast to the chaos that had become my life. The reflection staring back at me from the water's surface seemed like that of a stranger hollow eyes, a face marked by lines of worry and guilt. "Thomas," a voice called softly from behind me. I turned to see William standing there, his expression pained. "Do you have a moment?" I nodded, gesturing for him to sit beside me. He lowered himself onto the grass, the two of us sitting in companionable silence for a few moments. "Do you ever wonder if we're on the right side?" he asked finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. The question took me by surprise, though I had been wrestling with similar thoughts myself. "I don't know," I admitted. "We follow orders, we do what we're told. But after Limoges, I'm not sure anymore." William sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's hard to see the point of it all when you're surrounded by so much death and destruction. I thought I was fighting for something noble, but now I just feel lost." His words resonated deeply with me. We had been taught to believe in the righteousness of our cause, to see ourselves as defenders of our kingdom. But the reality of war had stripped away those illusions, leaving behind only doubt and sorrow. The days turned into weeks as we continued our campaign, moving from town to town, village to village. Each place we visited bore the scars of conflict, the people weary and fearful. The Black Prince drove us forward relentlessly, his determination unwavering, but among the ranks the discontent grew. One evening, as we camped near a small village, I overheard a group of soldiers talking in hushed tones. They spoke of desertion, of fleeing the army, and seeking a new life far from the horrors of war. The idea was tempting, but the thought of abandoning my comrades, of being branded a traitor, held me back. As I lay in my tent that night, the voices of the deserters echoed in my mind. Their words stirred something within me, a longing for peace, for a life untainted by bloodshed. But how could I walk away when so many depended on us, when the fate of our kingdom hung in the balance? The answer came unexpectedly one morning as we prepared to march once more. The Black Prince called for an assembly, his voice commanding as he addressed us. "We have received word," he began, "of a large French force gathering to the north. Our scouts report they are preparing for a major offensive. We cannot allow this threat to go unanswered. We march at first light." The announcement was met with a mixture of resolve and resignation. We had faced countless battles, but the prospect of another major confrontation weighed heavily on us all. As we broke camp, I found myself seeking out William. He was packing his gear, his movements slow and deliberate. When he saw me approaching, he offered a weak smile. "Another battle, eh?" he said, his tone weary. "Seems so," I replied, my heart heavy. "William, Have you ever thought about what you'd do after all this? If we ever see an end to this war?" He paused, considering my question. "Sometimes. I think about going back home, maybe finding a bit of land, settling down. A simple life away from all this madness." The image was a comforting one, a glimpse of a future that seemed increasingly distant. "That sounds nice," I said softly, "but for now we have a job to do." He nodded, the shadow of doubt still lingering in his eyes. "Let's just hope we make it through." The next few days were a blur of preparation and marching as we made our way north to intercept the French force. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. We knew the coming battle would be fierce, but there was a sense of inevitability about it. We had been through so much already. What was one more fight? When we finally encountered the French army, it was on a wide, open plain. Both sides arrayed their forces, the banners fluttering in the breeze, the sun glinting off the armour and weapons. It was a scene of stark beauty, a moment of calm before the storm. As the two armies faced off, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. We had been here before countless times, always on the brink of another bloody conflict. But something was different this time. There was a weariness, a fatigue that seemed to permeate both sides. The battle began with the usual ferocity, the clash of steel, the roar of the combatants, the chaos of war. I fought with all my strength, my movements driven by muscle memory and instinct. But as the hours wore on, the fighting took its toll. The lines blurred, the distinction between friend and foe became a tangle of blood and desperation. Amidst the chaos, I found myself facing a French knight. His armour was battered, his eyes weary, but there was a determination in his stance. We circled each other, our swords raised, each waiting for the other to make a move. He lunged first, his blade aimed at my chest. I parried the force of the blow, sending a shock through my arm. We traded strikes, each seeking an opening, each aware that one misstep could mean death. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the same weariness that I felt. We were two sides of the same coin, caught in a cycle of violence that neither of us truly wanted. With a final, desperate strike, I disarmed him, my sword at his throat. He looked up at me, his expression one of resignation. "Finish it," he said, his voice hoarse. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the hilt of my sword. But in that instant, I saw myself in him, the same doubts, the same fears. Lowering my weapon, I stepped back, allowing him to rise. "Go," I said quietly, "live to see another day." He looked at me in disbelief, then nodded, turning and disappearing into the chaos of battle. As I watched him go, a strange sense of peace settled over me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I had chosen mercy. The battle raged on, but the outcome was inevitable. We fought with everything we had, but both sides were exhausted, drained by years of relentless conflict. As night fell, the fighting finally subsided, the field littered with the dead and dying. We had survived, but at what cost? The 100 Years' War continued, an endless cycle of bloodshed and loss. But in that brief moment of mercy, I had found a glimmer of hope. Perhaps one day we could find a way to end this madness, to rebuild what had been destroyed. As we gathered the wounded and tended to the fallen, I found William. He had survived the battle, though he bore a deep gash on his arm. We sat together in the quiet aftermath, the stars shining brightly above us. "Maybe there's hope after all," I said softly, my eyes on the horizon. William nodded, his gaze distant. "Maybe. For now, we keep fighting. But one day, this will end." And so, with the promise of a distant peace in our hearts, we continued our march. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but we faced it together, driven by the hope that someday the cycle of violence would be broken and we could finally find peace. The days following the battle were a blur of movement and recovery. We had pushed the French back, but the cost was high. Our ranks were thinned, and the faces of comrades lost weighed heavily on us all. The Black Prince, ever the stoic leader, showed little outward emotion, but I could see the strain in his eyes. We continued our march, each step heavy with the burden of our shared experiences. The countryside we traversed was scarred by war. Villages lay in ruins, fields were burnt and abandoned, and the once vibrant life of the land was replaced by an eerie silence. As we passed through these desolate places, I felt a growing sense of unease. The war had ravaged not just the people, but the very soul of the land itself. One evening, as we made camp near a small, abandoned village, I found myself drawn to the remnants of a chapel. Its roof had caved in, and the walls were blackened by fire, but a sense of reverence still lingered in the air. I entered, the floor creaking under my weight, and sat on a broken pew, my mind wandering. Seeking solace, a voice asked from behind me. I turned to see William, his arm bandaged, but otherwise seeming to recover well. "Something like that," I replied, just trying to make sense of it all. He sat beside me, the two of us enveloped in the quiet of the ruined chapel. "It's hard to find meaning in all this," he said, "but sometimes we have to create our own meaning, find something worth holding on to." I nodded, his words resonating with the turmoil inside me. "What do you hold on to, William?" He looked thoughtful, his gaze distant. "Hope," he said simply. "Hope that one day we'll see an end to this, that we'll find peace, and that we can rebuild what's been destroyed." The following days were spent in relative calm. We received word that the French were regrouping, but for the moment we had a brief respite. The Black Prince ordered us to fortify our positions and prepare for the next inevitable clash. In the quiet moments, I often found myself reflecting on William's words. Hope. It seemed a fragile thing, yet it was all we had. One afternoon, as I was helping to repair a section of our defences, a rider approached our camp at a gallop. His armour was marked with the crest of the Black Prince, and his face was set in a grim expression. He dismounted swiftly and sought an audience with the prince. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed at a distance. The rider spoke in hushed tones, but I caught fragments of the conversation. There were rumours of a significant French force amassing, possibly aiming to retake territory we had gained. The Black Prince listened intently, his face a mask of concentration. "We must be prepared," the rider concluded. "They will not rest until they have regained what they've lost." The prince nodded, his expression grim. "We shall meet them head on," he said firmly. "There can be no retreat." The mood in the camp shifted once more. The brief respite we had enjoyed gave way to renewed tension and preparation for the next engagement. We drilled daily, our bodies pushed to the limit as we readied ourselves for the coming storm. As we prepared, I found myself thinking more and more about the future. The brutality of Limoges, the faces of the townsfolk, and the mercilessness of our campaign haunted me. Yet, amidst the darkness, there was a sliver of hope. William's words echoed in my mind, a beacon of light in the gloom. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, casting long shadows across the camp, I sought out William. I found him near the edge of our encampment, gazing out over the landscape. "William," I called softly. He turned, his face lighting up with a weary smile. "Thomas, what's on your mind?" I hesitated, then spoke the thoughts that had been swirling within me. "Do you really believe we can find peace? That this war will end?" He looked thoughtful, his gaze turning to the horizon. "I have to believe it," he said quietly. "Otherwise, what are we fighting for? It's the hope of a better future that keeps me going." His words struck a chord within me. Despite the horrors we had faced, the endless battles, and the bloodshed, the hope for a better future was something worth fighting for. It was a fragile, tenuous hope, but it was all we had. The next morning, we received orders to move out. The French forces were on the move, and we were to intercept them. The air was thick with anticipation as we marched, the ground trembling under the weight of our steps. The battle that followed was one of the fiercest we had faced. The French were determined, their resolve unshaken by previous defeats. The clash of steel and the roar of battle filled the air as we engaged, each of us driven by the hope that this might be the final push, the decisive moment that would turn the tide of the war. I fought with a renewed vigour, William at my side. The chaos of battle was a familiar yet harrowing experience. Each swing of my sword, each parry and strike, was driven by the hope of an end to the bloodshed. The faces of the fallen haunted me, a reminder of the cost of our fight. The hours blurred into one another, the battle raging on. At times it seemed as though neither side would yield, each determined to outlast the other. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, the air thick with the scent of blood and sweat. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield, the French lines began to waver. Their resolve, while strong, was not unbreakable. We pressed forward, seizing the advantage, our determination pushing us beyond our limits. With a final desperate surge, we broke through their lines. The French forces began to retreat, their spirit broken. We pursued them for a short distance, but the order came to halt. The battle was won, the field ours. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the cries of the wounded filled the air, I sought out William. He was standing near a cluster of our men, his face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "We did it," I said, approaching him. He nodded, a weary smile on his face. "For now, at least, but the war isn't over yet." His words were a sobering reminder of the reality we faced. While we had won the battle, the war raged on. Yet in that moment I felt a glimmer of hope. We had survived, and with each victory we edged closer to the possibility of peace. As we tended to the wounded and honoured the fallen, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still fraught with danger and uncertainty, but we faced it together, driven by the hope that one day the war would end and we could rebuild what had been lost. With the promise of a better future in our hearts, we continued our march. The scars of war would remain, but so too would the hope that had kept us going. And in that hope, I found the strength to carry on, to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that one day we would find peace.